Right, we now welcome Justin Walker, who's going to be talking about banking and global entrapment. I shall be watching the time very, very closely.
I bet you will. Thank you very much. I hope, can you all hear me all right? Excellent. Right, global entrapment by the central banking system. Now, those of us who know and understand military history, Field Marshal Montgomery, or General Montgomery was, as he was then, in the Western Desert, in the forward tactical headquarters in his caravan, always had a picture of Rommel up there so he could look at him. He said, if you're going to win, you've got to know your enemy. Get behind the enemy. How do they work? Well, we metaphorically are going to war against the traitors. We're going to defeat them in battle. We're going to flush them out, send them down the Thames, and we are going to take power. Our mindset is going to take power. But we need to know who the real enemy is. Now, why has the world not got enough money to prevent this from happening? This is in the third world, as it's called. But this is in our country. Food banks, people who are vulnerable, they are struggling. Why? Because there isn't enough money in the system. Why on earth have I put that up? The Death Star to Star Wars. Has Justin finally lost it? The Death Star, for all those who know the films, the Death Star is the evil hub, where it all comes from, the evil. Darth Vader, and I'm not really a great fan of it, but anyway, you get the drift. Up there, hidden away, is the Death Star. Here is the terrestrial version of the Death Star, or as David Pidcock said to me the other day, call it the Debt Star. This is, my friend, this sinister-looking building, which is in the beautiful city of Basel. This hideous thing is the Bank for International Settlements. And this is your real enemy. Now, Schalmerschlacht, Hitler's finance minister, Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England from 1920 until 1944, so he did a hell of a long stretch, created between them the Bank for International Settlements. Allegedly, it was there to look after First World War German war reparations, but it had nothing of the sort. It had a more hidden, sinister agenda. Let's take this quote from Montague Norman. Capital must protect itself in every possible way, both by combination and legislation. Debts must be collected, mortgages foreclosed as rapidly as possible. When, through the process of law, the common people lose their homes, they will become more docile and more easily governed through the strong arm of government, applied by a central power of wealth under leading financiers. These truths are well known amongst our principal men who are now engaged in forming an imperialism to govern the world. By dividing the voter through the political party system, we can get them to expend their energies in fighting for questions of no importance. It is thus, by discreet action, we can secure for ourselves that which has been so well planned and so successfully accomplished. Now, thank goodness for this chap. Professor Carroll Quigley, not everyone's heard of him, but he wrote a book, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, in 1966. He was a mentor to Bill Clinton. He was an insider. He was actually accepted into the inner confines of the elite. And they liked to show off. And he recorded this. And this is what he wrote. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country, and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements, arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralization of world economic control and use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups. So, what do we know about this Bank for International Settlements? controls 60 of the world's central banks, including the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and the European Central Banks. Oversees at least 95% of the world's money supply. It gave itself diplomatic immunity. It's unbelievable. It can operate in complete secrecy and is unaccountable to no elected government. And barely 1% of humanity knows anything about it. Let me give you two quick examples. I moved down to South Devon this year. For the last 10 years, 12 years, I was up in Cumbria, and my MP for 9 of those years was Tim Farron, now leader of the Liberal Democrats. Yes, you hadn't grown. You have every right to groan. I and Penny, we went to see him, and I asked him, have you ever heard the Bank for International Settlements? He said, no, I suppose you're going to tell me. We've got it on film. When I told him, the man looked somewhat sheepish. Then, this year, I thought, well, I have to get to know my new local MP, so I went to see her, Sarah Wollaston, who is the chair of the Health Select Committee. So I asked her, I said, have you ever heard of the Bank for International Settlements? No, she hadn't. So when I told her, she looked sheepish. It's incredible. So, nobody knows outside this room, well, barely 1% know anything about it. So this has to be our main target. Now, Professor Quigley goes on, it must not be felt that these heads of the world's chief central banks were themselves substantive powers in world finance. They were not. Rather, they were the technicians and agents of the dominant investment bankers of their own countries, who had raised them up and were perfectly capable of throwing them down. The substantive financial powers of the world were in the hands of these investment bankers, also called international or merchants bankers, who renamed largely behind the scenes in their own unincorporated banks. These formed a system of international cooperation and national dominance, which was more private, more powerful, and more secret than that of their agents in the central banks. And we're talking about the House of Rothschild, the Warburgs, the Rockefellers, the Goldman Sachs, the Oppenheim, Medici family, and the Morgan Stanleys. I mean, there are others as well. The point is, these are the people who decide how much money the world has to spend. But remember that sovereign nations, what is the biggest lie affecting mankind? That sovereign nations have to borrow money that is being completely created out of thin air as debt from the private financial and banking sector when government taxation receipts are outweighed by government expenditure. In other words, every politician, every economist says, you have to borrow money when it runs out from the private financial sector. But let's see what the Bank of England told us in the spring of 2014. In the modern economy, most money takes the form of bank deposits, but how those bank deposits are created is often misunderstood. The principal way is through commercial banks making loans. Whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. I think that's the end of my presentation. So what I am saying is very simple. The question we have to take out there is, how is money created and by whom? And then when you are informing people, tell them about the Bank for International Settlements. It's time we gave the publicity. I think I have got one more slide. Here it is, I've just remembered. Yes, if the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, and its criminal central banking system was collapsed and destroyed, the world's nations, by harnessing the simple fiscal measure of sovereign national credit, and David Pidcock will be explaining more about that later on, would have the debt-free and interest-free money or liquidity needed to cancel global poverty and austerity, whilst at the same time creating real prosperity, security, and happiness for all of humanity. In other words, our job is to bring down the Bank for International Settlements. Thank you very much.
All right.